looking forward to Thursday afternoons as we unpack what the G20 is up to. Good information to know as we head towards November.
Well, absolutely. So let's talk about it today. The G20 finance ministers, and there's so many different angles to G20. So the finance ministers and central bank governors are meeting in KZN, and the finance track meeting focuses on fostering global economic stability, enhancing international financial cooperation, and addressing pressing global challenges.
And I must say, Ashraf, as you know, chief among global challenges is the issue of debt and the debt burden on the African continent. So that's a huge area of focus, how the debt burden is impacting and affecting the economies on the African continent. And you will remember that in previous meetings, there were calls for the G20 countries to encourage credit rating agencies to enhance the transparency of their rating methodologies and models. So important to know what it is that they consider when downgrading countries.
Wow, it's a big issue indeed. So let's get some answers. We're joined now on the line by Dr. Duncan Pieterse, the Director General at South Africa's National Treasury. Dr. Pieterse, good chatting to you. Thanks for connecting on the National Pulse.
Thanks for having me, Ashraf and Thami. Happy to be here.
Absolutely. Because as I say, National Pulse, I need to say SAFM / Channel Africa. It's quite unique, and maybe that collaboration reflects how we need to collaborate as a continent as well, not just as a country, right? So first things first, we've touched on the issue of debt levels and how important that is. But let me put this to you, Dr. Pieterse. Outside of that, what are the other issues that are being raised, discussed, and debated at your two-day finance track meeting?
Well, Ashraf, there's quite a lot. So I'll try and run through as many of them as I can. And they are all the various issues that relate to the finance of the G20. So we spend quite a lot of time talking about the global economy, what the different issues and pressures are, and how we can collaborate better to take that forward. There's also been a lot of discussion about international taxation, because of course you're bringing all the systemically important finance ministers into the room, and so alignment on tax policy is quite critical. There's been a lot of discussions about sustainable finance, about the international financial architecture, the reform agenda of multilateral development banks. We've also been doing some work on health and finance. We ran a very interesting pandemic financing simulation exercise, and then there are a few other areas as well, but it's quite a packed agenda.
Okay.
And we'll talk about that health and financing and that pandemic preparedness a little bit later on. But what I'd like to focus on now is the issue of debt, which we raised a bit earlier on. The statistics are showing that 38% of developing countries spend over 10% of their revenue on interest payments on loans. So this is even before you start paying off the loans themselves. The interest is in itself burdensome. Could you perhaps highlight for us, Duncan, some of the proposals that have been put forward and have been put on the table by South Africa, and perhaps any of those who are present as well within the G20 to ease this burden?
Absolutely. But before I get to the proposals, let me say that, of course, as South Africa, this is not something that is foreign to us. You would note that as the National Treasury, we've highlighted the fact over the last few years that in our case, where debt service costs or interest payments on an annual basis, which is around 350 billion, exceeds the budgets of police, it exceeds the budget of health, and it exceeds the budget of many other critically important spending items. So this is an issue for South Africa, it's an issue for the continent and many other countries around the world. In terms of the G20 conversation, we have focused on a few different areas. One is there's been a big discussion around Africa's development and the specific challenges in an African context. Debt is one of them, but there are others as well, like the cost of capital, macroeconomic vulnerabilities, the infrastructure deficit, and so on. We've also made some really good tangible progress around how we deal with debt distress. You may know that for countries that are in debt distress, there's a process called the common framework, where debtors and creditors are brought together with each other and with other parties like the rating agencies and so on, and where we discuss how to resolve the debt distress situations of those countries. And we've spent a lot of time on improving the common framework. We published a note on that, and Ethiopia's debt distress negotiations were finalized in the last week in a 12-month period, which is far shorter than other countries who have gone through a similar process like Zambia and Ghana have taken. So there's a lot of sort of important policy thinking that's happening, but also some very practical work around how to improve the debt distress challenges on the continent.
And if I can come in there, I mean, there's been lots of talk about the issues of ratings agencies, and as we know, how it impacts a country when these agencies rate a country, right? So with that in mind, give us a sense of the plans being made, because I believe there's a call now to improve transparency, so that countries and nations know exactly why they're being judged the way they are, right? What are your thoughts about that? What are the plans and some of the specific mechanisms that are being put in place and maybe being raised at the G20 at your coming together today?
So we have not had a specific discussion about rating agencies, but the topic was raised in the presentation by former Finance Minister Trevor Manuel in his capacity as chair of the Africa panel to the G20 and that advises the Minister of Finance of South Africa on G20 matters, and they raised the issue quite sharply, and a lot of countries in the room, I think, agreed with the sentiment shared there in two important ways. One, the point you make around transparency of the methodologies and making sure that we bring rating agencies into the discussions. So we had a workshop on debt issues a few weeks ago, where the rating agencies themselves were also participating in the workshop in order to share their methodologies and transparency. And the other part of it is the ability of rating agencies to properly understand the jurisdictions within which they operate, so that they can more accurately rate those sovereigns. And I think there is an acknowledgement by some of the rating agencies that there's some work to do on their side to better understand the context within which they operate, so that the outcomes of their rating procedures and methodologies more fairly reflect those environments.
I'd like to pick up on this issue that we discussed a little bit earlier, Dr. Duncan, around health and financing, and that also being one of your key considerations. Obviously, there is a health track within the G20, and they've recently been focusing on pandemic preparedness as well as response. There's the issue of universal health coverage as well, strengthening health systems, etc. But talk to us about how these two tracks have to work concurrently in order to come up with holistic solutions, specifically around the issues that the G20 is focusing on, where health is concerned. Perhaps if you could highlight some of the funding structures that are being proposed to enhance the global pandemic preparedness, which is one of the key areas of focus.
Yes, I think our focus in the finance track is unsurprisingly on the finance issues. I think one of the benefits that we've had from the COVID experience has been how it has demonstrated the fact that we have quite a lot of work to do to improve coordination amongst different countries on financing of our response to a global pandemic situation. And of course, that's where finance ministers become quite important. Health ministers are critical from a policy response point of view, to the extent that you have a global pandemic like COVID, it's going to be very important for finance ministers to establish the mechanisms through which they coordinate. And that's why the pandemic financing simulation exercise that we held earlier this week with the support of the World Bank was quite important, because it took us through a hypothetical case where an epidemic in a particular part of the world spreads to have global implications, and then we spoke about what are the different ways in which finance ministers can coordinate their response, what are the different mechanisms from a financing point of view that they can bring to bear, and what are the different facilities that are available throughout our health financing ecosystem that can also help support our response. So it was a very different kind of discussion for the G20 because it was very practically oriented, but I think the members in the room found it very, very valuable and insightful, and we've made these kinds of practical initiatives a key part of our discussions on health financing.
Interesting, you're speaking of the room. Let's talk about the elephant that's in the room, and maybe the elephant that's not in the room, which is the USA, right? What are your thoughts about the implications of the USA being effectively a non-participant with G20, and how you prepare around that?
Well, it's important to correct that because the USA are participating. They were in our virtual communique drafting session last week for 2 days, and they participated this week, starting on Monday, in the deputies meetings that I chaired alongside the central bank deputy Rashad Kasim, and they have been my counterpart, the US deputy. Has been in all of the meetings, and there's a US team here as well. Of course, the US Treasury Secretary is not here for the finance ministers and central bank governors meeting, but there are other finance ministers who couldn't make it either, and often that is more a case of domestic responsibilities and commitments rather than anything else. So we've had good engagements with the US this week. They are represented, and I think they've really helped us to have a very substantive discussion. Yeah.
And I'm glad, Ashraf, that you actually asked that question around the United States, and maybe it is an opportunity, Dr. Duncan, to actually clarify this, because we do know that the United States was very vocal at the beginning of South Africa's G20 presidency, and this is largely due to strained relations with South Africa at the time, that they were not really keen on participating. Where do they stand right now, and what has been the level of their participation? Can we just put that to rest once and for all, based on the experience and the lived experience of how these track meetings have been conducted and unfolding?
Yeah, so I'm not entirely engaged in the Sherpa track. You know that there's a separate Sherpa track that is led by the international relations counterparts, and I don't know what the US's participation has been there, but in the finance track, which the National Treasury coordinates with the South African Reserve Bank, we have had engagements with our US counterparts throughout in most of the meetings we've had. They have certainly been at all of our deputies meetings throughout our presidency, and the engagement has been there. Of course, the US is planning to take over the presidency of the G20 next year, and our understanding from them is that they intend to continue to do so, and therefore it is quite difficult then to be in a situation where you are not attending deputies meetings or discussions during our presidency and then to take over the presidency next year. So certainly from a finance track perspective, there has been engagement. We've been working on a communique last week and this week here in Zimbabwe. And what's important about that is that it's a consensus document. And so all the members in the room have to agree to the language that is used there. And our US colleagues have been part of those discussions and negotiations.
Okay, that's where we can leave it. Appreciate your input for the last 15 minutes or so, Dr. Duncan Pieterse, Director General at South Africa's National Treasury, and as part of this G20 SAFM Channel Africa collaboration. Thami, as always, thanks for joining us too. Let's now get to the news headlines. Here's Ondela.
Thank you, Ashraf. On the news headlines, the Film and Publications Board wants individuals behind social media posts depicting child sexual abuse material to be exposed and prosecuted. Trade Union Solidarity has threatened strike action at local and regional